it's been said a few times throughout these 2 days, but I have a strong sense, and I've had this for a while, that there is a significant move of God beginning to happen. It's like a wave is coming. A wave is coming that is going to completely transform the church, and it's going to turn this nation and the nations of the world upside down. You know, we know through the scripture that day is going to come, but I believe actually spiritually, prophetically, something significant is being unlocked and loosened, and just have a strong sense that worship and ushering in the presence of God is going to be absolutely key in all of this. For Rachel and I, there's these two verses that have been really significant for us over the years. And it's from Psalm 27, verses 13 and 14. It simply says this: I remain confident of this, I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord. It's a psalm written, they think, by King David himself. Perhaps a psalm written when he was under a huge amount of pressure. But also a psalm that's single-minded in David's pursuit of God. You know, one thing I ask, that's how it begins. One thing I seek, that I may see you. And I just can't shrug off this sense that we are going to see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living in a whole new way. And it's one of the things that I live for, to see more of God, to see his kingdom at work in the most unlikely, dark places. And you know, this year, Rachel and I, we've had the privilege of seeing some incredible things, moments where it's kind of, they've grabbed our hearts, and it's like, this is what we're living for. This is what we've been dreaming about. Last May, we went to Northern Ireland. We went to a place in Causeway, and there's a vineyard there, Causeway Vineyard. Alan and Catherine Scott. And Alan and Catherine Scott both were here last year, and they're an amazing couple. And they've just been quietly, over a decade now, leading and serving this local church, preaching about the kingdom of God. But you know, over the last 7 months, they have seen 2,200 people give their lives to Christ for the first time. And it's remarkable. 60% of those commitments have happened outside of the church building. There's an amazing man called Mark Marks who goes out on the streets, and he's been doing this for years and years and years, in the sun and usually in Northern Ireland in the rain. And he just goes and he begins to pray for people on the streets, prays for the sick, and they've seen remarkable stories of healing. But one of my favorite stories was about this man called Tom. And when he was 81 years old, this is a year or so ago, he began a conversation in the streets with one of their team and gave his life to Christ, started going to the church. 81, he thought, you know, what am I going to do with my life? Love it. And he thought, I'll do their kind of year out. They do like a gap year, I guess. Never too late for a gap year. And he just did this gap year where they were training him up in evangelism and outreach and mission. In that year, Tom, who's 81 years old, he led 34 people to Christ himself. You know, when God's Spirit is poured out, when the wave comes, it's not about looks, it's not about age, it's not about gifting, it's about availability. You know, in another story, they were saying that it's a season where they have a bunch of marches and protests in Northern Ireland. It can get a bit, unpleasant and tense in the city. And the police, this is the police, they came to Alan as the pastor and said, look, we've got these marches and these protests coming out. Can we ask you, could you please ask that your church would come and be a presence on our streets during the marches? Because we have noticed when your church is on the streets, the whole atmosphere changes. You know, this is the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Something that's so much more extraordinary, so much more profound than anything we could muster up in our own human efforts and energies. You know, Nikki mentioned about these church plants. I think there's a photo that's going to come up. Last Saturday, you're reading the Times, and then suddenly there's this article in the Times about all these church plants coming out of HTB. This is Tim Matthews. This is he's got a lot of love to give as well. And he's based in Bournemouth, and they've just started, and that's Bournemouth up there. And, you know, they're just beginning to see amazing things happening. Norwich, Brighton, yeah, there we go. Lincoln even. And we're just seeing these dead churches, these kind of come to life. People who are far away from God beginning to come back to the Father who loves them. And actually the world are beginning to wake up and say, wow, what is this? What is this? The wave is coming. The wave is coming. Now, I don't know if we have any surfers here, but I've always thought surfing just looks like the coolest thing in the world, doesn't it? Man, I wish I could surf. You see the photos and you see these bronzed, ripped guys, you know, walking around, you know, the beach, and it's like, oh man, I want to be that. And a few times throughout my life, I've tried to surf. And I remember one time in South Africa, and here we go. South Africa's here. We were, I had some time off, and we'd met this guy who's kind of hosting us, and he's a big surfer, and I was like, oh mate, take me surfing, you know, let's go surfing, you know, Point Break style, it's going to be amazing. And so we go down to the beach, and, you know, he gives me this wetsuit, and I put it on, and I'm like, oh, I feel great in this, you know, it kind of sucks everything in, and kind of, it's like, woo! And, you know, just feeling the part, and then he gives me this surfboard, and I'm standing there, my wetsuit, the surfboard, and I'm like, I'm a surfer. This is it, I'm one of you, I'm like you, dude, you know, all of the kind of language, and then he's like, okay, we're just going to paddle out, and we're going to kind of paddle out over the kind of incoming waves, and then we'll get to a space where we can wait for bigger waves to come, and we'll catch waves. When the wave comes, you're going to paddle hard, and you're going to catch the wave, and you're going to get on your knees, and then you're going to stand up, and then you're going to surf. I was like, of course, fantastic, sounds so easy. Anyway, he kind of charges off, and I'm kind of begin paddling out. And every time a wave hits me, you know, the surfboard goes off, and I'm like, tossed back. And literally, no word of a lie, after about 15 minutes, I still haven't made it out beyond the kind of waves. And I'm, by this time, exhausted. My arms are aching. I'm like, I'm done. This is so embarrassing. And then the ultimate humiliation. You know, I'm like in my early 20s at this point. And he says, okay, you grab hold of my board, and I'm going to paddle both of us out there. You know, this is like, that's not in the surf movies. So there I am, like, oh, so holding on, and he's like paddling, and I'm like spent. And we eventually get out, and then we sit on our boards, and we're waiting for the big waves to come. And you probably guessed it, but however hard I tried, I could not catch a wave. And when I did, I couldn't stand up. And after about an hour or so, I kind of went in completely humiliated. Because the thing is, surfing looks amazing, but what they often don't tell you, the expert surfers will tell you that 90% of surfing is working and waiting. Working against the tide and waiting. And it's only 10% that is actually riding that wave. The wave is coming, but it's not always easy. Rach.
Like Tim, we just love being here, love seeing what God is doing here today and hearing about what God is doing around the world. And it's amazing, isn't it, hearing those stories. And for Tim and I personally, we have prayed to see the goodness of God in the land of the living. We prayed to see the wave in our church, in our neighborhood, in our own lives. Who doesn't want to see the wave? Who doesn't love the wave? You know, the wave is exhilarating. The wave is what stories are made of. The wave is what you hear about on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook. But as Tim said, 90% of surfing is working against the tide and waiting for the wave. It's overcoming disappointments, failures, knockbacks, frustrations. It's the stuff that doesn't feature on social media that much. And we want to look at those verses that Tim mentioned, Psalm 27, verse 13 and 14. I remain confident of this. I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord. Be strong, take heart, and wait for the Lord. And you know, the Message translation goes like this. I'm sure now I'll see the goodness of God in the exuberant earth. Stay with God. Take heart. Don't quit. I'll say it again. Stay with God. And Tim took us through verse 13 very beautifully, I have to say. Thank you, darling. And I want us to look at verse 14 together. If verse 13 is like that 10% of riding the wave, then verse 14 is that 90%. It's the working against the tide. It's the waiting for the wave. Now, as you know, I'm not a worship leader. I actually did used to sing backing vocals with Tim a while ago. And then I realized as I was thinking about this, I just gradually disappeared off the rota. I don't quite know what happened. But yeah, we'll discuss that later, I reckon. So when Tim asked if I would share some thoughts tonight, I knew I wouldn't be able to bring any sort of practical insights into leading worship, but I had this sense that I should just be honest about what this year, this last little season, has been like. Because you know, spiritually, this year hasn't felt like a riding the wave kind of a year. Don't know if anybody else shares with me in that experience. This year has been more like a verse 14 year than a verse 13 year, spiritually. Now, Tim and I, we've got 4 kids together, and they're all still pretty young, hopefully asleep in bed right now. And the last 7 years, my primary role has been to be at home, to care for, and to nurture them. And you know, it's been 7 years of knowing without a doubt that I'm exactly in the right place. I'm doing exactly what God has called me to do for now. I've experienced the joy of raising my babies. You know, it's amazing. In fact, I was just thinking, was anybody here at the Worship Central conference 7 years ago when Al and Tim brought up their new little babies, Phoebe and Kester? Maybe, I don't know that anyone was here then. Well, Phoebe, our eldest daughter, is now 7, and you know, part of the joy in raising kids, she wrote her first worship song this week. It was absolutely beautiful. It went, God, I live for you. I'll do anything for you. That's why I'm not on the worship team anymore, as you can hear. But it was, God, I'll live for you. I will do anything for you. And she's just singing that line out. And then Tim gets his guitar out, and he's like, darling, should we try and put some music to it? And Phoebe's like, okay. And Tim starts playing some chords, and she's like, no, Daddy, that's not right. You're not playing that right. It goes like this. And I'm thinking, yeah, I mean, what does he know about songwriting? You know, come on. But it was beautiful. I sat back and I just thought, my work is done. My work is done. My 7-year-old daughter is singing these beautiful words to God. But you know, it's also been 7 years of wrestling. 7 years of being the one at home. 7 years of giving into this lie that I must be missing out on the really exciting stuff, the important stuff, the wave. It's also been a cost to put some of my dreams on hold. And I've also had to look closely at my relationship with God in those 7 years because it had to change. I had to find a new way of relating to God, to learn to meaningfully connect with God in the mundane and in the everyday stuff. I've had to choose to look beyond my everyday routine, which is pretty packed, and to ask and to see what God is doing in my neighborhood, in the lives of the people around me. And it's definitely not always been easy. I've not always been that gracious about it, as Tim will testify, but I long to see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living, in the middle of this hidden and hectic season. And isn't that all what we want? Isn't that why we're here? Just to catch a glimpse of the wave, the goodness of God. Events like this, we see it, we taste it. And doesn't it make you want to go back to where you've come from and to see the goodness of God there? To see it in the everyday, the ordinariness of our lives. And so on one level, this year has been great. You know, much to be thankful for. Friends, family, church, lots of blessings. And yet spiritually, it's been tough. Full of disappointment and discouragement. We have lived in the same part of London for the last 9 years, and we've got to know quite intentionally the people who live around us. And we've longed to see God visibly at work in their lives. We've prayed and prayed for these friends over the years. Prayed that they might see God, know Jesus for themselves, taste the goodness of God. That God would break into their lives in a powerful way. And yeah, there have been a couple of breakthroughs in that time, but nothing like what we long to see. Nothing like the wave, nothing like that verse 13 that we read. You know, in our house, by our front door, I think it's going to come up, we have those words written. I wrote them 11 years ago. I'm not very creative, as you can see, but they are, Tim framed them for me, and we put them up by our front door. And so those words are carried in and out of each day. And as we've prayed and invested in those friendships, and as I've stepped out in faith myself, and I've invited a bunch of these neighbors to everything happening at church with not much success, I have to say. I've been looking and asking God, what are you doing? What am I missing? What am I not seeing? Believing somehow that He is at work here, and yet only seeing a glimpse. And at times, I've just wanted to give up. I've wanted to walk away. And then as I've pleaded with God for these people, I've sensed His heart for them. And my heart has ached with His, that they might come home one day. That they might come home. And a while ago, I felt God say that I should run an Alpha course in our home. As I said, I'd been inviting people along to these events at church, and people had always said, oh, it's too far to go because London's kind of spread out. And so I felt God say, well, run an Alpha course in your home. Step out, go for it. And I was like, no way. That's like really, really vulnerable. And that nagging sense just wouldn't go away. And so I plucked up the courage to email 17 friends who lived in our immediate neighborhood to ask them to come and join me and do an Alpha course in our living room. And I wrote their names in my journal, and I prayed and I fasted that they may come. And over the next few days, one by one, they said no. And I had to painfully cross their names out of my journal. And as I looked at that list of all those crossed out names, rationally I could tell myself, you know, it's okay, you stepped out, you took a risk, you were obedient, one said yes, and yet deep inside I felt like such a failure. I felt kind of embarrassed, to be honest, like I wasn't going to put that on my Instagram, you know? I couldn't understand it. I'd put myself out there probably like you guys do week after week as you lead at church. One person said yes. And I remember thinking, clearly I care more about these people than God does. That doesn't make sense. Have you ever felt like that? I wanted to cancel the whole thing and never leave the house again, quite honestly. And then somebody else said maybe. But I was furious with God. I felt let down. I felt like he hadn't fulfilled his side of the bargain. And eventually I did the only thing I knew to do, and that was to go back to him. And I remember on that particular morning, I'd got up early before the kids were awake so that I could just go and have some time on my own with God. And I felt pretty disillusioned in that moment as I put my headphones in and I put my worship playlist on. And I had to choose then to sing about this God of the impossible, this God who can work miracles, this God who saves, this God who transforms life, this God who says he puts his power in us. And in that moment, I felt God speak to me, and I felt him say this: don't you dare give up. Don't you dare back down. Because whether you see it or not, I am at work. I am advancing my kingdom. And what might look like failure to you is not to me. Because I care deeply about that one person. And I want to keep drawing you in. I want to keep drawing you back to me so that you can see things how I see things. So don't you dare give up. Psalm 27, 13 and 14. Wait for the Lord. Be strong. Take heart. Wait for the Lord. Stay with God. Take heart. Don't quit. I'll say it again. Stay with God. And I realized in that moment two things. Firstly, if I was going to see the wave of God's goodness, I needed to wait for God. I needed to stay with God. And as I drew close to God, despite what I was feeling, I recognized that actually God is far more interested than me, far more interested in me drawing close to him than he is in any success story that I can bring to him. I realized that as I drew close to him, as I read his word, as I sang out the truth, as I clung to the promises, as I soaked in his presence, that it was the only thing that was going to sustain me as I work and as I wait for that wave. It was the only way I was going to keep sight of what I was waiting for. It was the only way that I was going to fend off cynicism and doubt and cultivate those eyes of hope and expectation. I once heard Heidi Baker say, greater intimacy leads to greater fruitfulness. Greater intimacy leads to greater fruitfulness. Not greater hard work, but greater intimacy. And if we want to see the fruit of Psalm 27, verse 14, we need to stay with God. I feel like that's been a theme that's been recurring over this whole day. I think God is telling us, it's simple, isn't it, really? We've got to draw close to him. If we're going to see this stuff, we've got to draw close to him. We've got to cultivate a relationship of intimacy. The second thing I realized in that moment, that if I was going to see the goodness of God, if I was going to see this wave of God, I needed to be strong and take heart. I needed to take heart and to not quit. I needed to persevere. And I had in my mind what success looked like. And to me, success was not one person saying yes. That's not what the wave was in my mind. And I realized then that God's view is much different to my view. Do I believe that God wants all 17 of those people to know him? Does he want my entire neighborhood to know him? Yes, I absolutely believe that. But I also think he wants me to be faithful in the small things. Not to be fixated on the big stuff, on the grand scale stuff, so that I miss the small things in the everyday of what he's doing, miss what he's doing in one person's life. Perseverance means you don't quit when things don't work out exactly as you plan them. It means you don't quit when it feels like failure, when it feels like disappointment. We have to trust that as we regularly plant those seeds of faith, week in, week out, that God is advancing his kingdom. That as our hearts are full of him, that our eyes are full of hope and expectation, we can take heart in that promise that we will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. And so back to my little Alpha story. So the yes and the maybe came. One was a lapsed Catholic, one had been raised a Buddhist. And no, it wasn't revival in southwest London, but it was absolutely beautiful. It was a total privilege watching two women take this journey of faith. It was a wave in its own right. And I could have missed it. There were seeds planted, and I have to believe that God is at work, even in those tiny steps of faith. And yet I know there's more. I know there's more. I have to believe there's more. I have to believe that I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Otherwise, what's the point? And so the question that we want to leave you with tonight is, are we going to live safe, small lives? Are we going to live lives based on our experiences from the past? Our past failures, our past disappointments? Or are we going to cling to the promise of Psalm 27, verse 14, like King David did? We have a choice. We can give up believing that the wave will ever come. And I think there's probably people here who have given up hoping that the wave will ever come. I think there's some people here, and that sense of failure and disappointment is so overwhelming, it's set in. It's set in. And you're almost ready to give up. You feel let down by God. You've lost hope. And like Tim was saying about surfing, like swimming out against the tide. Oh man, I feel this compassion for you. Almost I can see, because I know that feeling. It's like you've been swimming against the tide, and those waves have been pushing you back. And pushing you back. You know exactly who you are. You've been struggling just to keep your head above the water. And you're like, forget the wave. I'm sinking here. Those waves are pushing you back and pushing you back. I think there's other people here. And this is kind of hard to say, but I think you might have this warped sense of what the wave looks like. Maybe you think it's fame, notoriety. Maybe you think it's like about songs being well known and sung all over the place, and that's not bad, but that's not the wave necessarily. It's not about big numbers. And I feel like in the last 24 hours, God has been speaking to you in the way that God does, that kind, gracious way. He's been reminding you that the wave of his goodness has nothing to do with your glory, our glory. It's very different. It's very different from the stuff that the world cares about. His goodness is about people getting free. His goodness is about people getting healed. His goodness is about us directing people's eyes to him. It has nothing to do with our glory. And yes, we all want maximum effect. We want to go back to our churches and see something big. And that's not wrong. But it has nothing to do with us seeking glory for ourselves. That's not the wave. Anyone else find that hard? I find that really hard. I find that really hard. I want the stories. I want the tweets and the Instagrams. I find that hard. We have to remind ourselves it is not about our glory. I think there's other people here tonight, and your sense of identity has got so caught up with doing the stuff. Doing the stuff. You are faithful. You are a faithful worship leader, faithful musician. You serve on your team faithfully, and it's all about getting the job done. It's all about getting the job done well. It's like the mission. But coming here, you've neglected your relationship with God. You've focused on the task of leading well. And actually, I sense that your identity has become so wound up in doing the stuff that you think God is more interested in you doing a job well done than he is in who you are. In who you are. And so for you, when that disappointment and when that failure comes, it is all the more painful because it taps into the deepest part of you. You feel like you've failed God, and yet God's saying, I am so much more interested in you. And you have no idea what it's like to lead out of that place of acceptance. Like Louis and Katie were saying earlier today, to stand up and lead knowing that your Father God delights over you, that is alien for you. And you're worn out by trying to keep going. But he delights in you. You've never known what it's like to do life with God rather than for God. And I think there's some people here who have grown cynical. You've grown cynical about seeing the wave, the goodness of God. Perhaps you've been praying and you have been waiting a very long time, and you long to see those signs of God's goodness breaking in. And now I wonder if when you hear people talking about signs and wonders, you get cynical. You think, they're just being naive. This stuff's not going to happen. And you know that your heart has grown hard. And I sense God saying he'd rather you be naive than cynical. Just want to end with a story about John Wimber. I don't know whether you know who John Wimber is, but he founded the Vineyard Church and a long time ago, and there was this amazing move of God a few decades ago, and John Wimber was a real sort of pioneer in that, a champion in that, and amazing signs and wonders took place. But John Wimber, before all of this kicked off, he had been praying and praying and praying that this wave would come. He read the Bible, and he believed that God could come and heal. He believed that God could come and move in supernatural power, and he wasn't seeing it. But he kept praying, and him and his team at their church, they would pray for people to get healed all the time, and nothing happened. In fact, him and his team, they got sick. They were like, this is crazy, but they kept praying. And at one point, John Wimber was close to giving up. And he was driving one day, and he felt God say, pull over. And God gave him this picture of like honey falling from the sky. And he knew that it was an encouragement to keep going. And the next time they stepped out and prayed, people just started getting healed all over the place. The wave had come. And you know why surfers go back? You know why they keep going back? Because they've tasted the wave. They've tasted the wave. They've tasted what it's like, the exhilaration of that 10%. And for us, when we've tasted the wave, we'll go back. We'll keep working. We'll keep waiting because we've tasted the wave of God's goodness. I remain confident of this. I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Be strong, take heart, and wait for the Lord.